We are now beginning the third session of this conference. The title of this session is Aberrations, Synthetics, and Weird Nature. And we are being joined by our panel. To my right, Ferda Kolatan. Ferda is an architect. He is also an educator. He's the founder of SU11 Architecture and Design in New York, and he's design faculty at University of Pennsylvania School of Design and Architecture. To my left, Lucy McRae is a science fiction artist, filmmaker, and body architect, probing the frontiers of the body, health, and human adaptability. Dowsing technology and femininity, she responds to complex future scenarios, inventing visual, iconic experiences that connect science with imagination. Then jumping back to my right, Theodore Spyropoulos is the director of Minima Forms in London, and he is also the director of the Architectural Association's Design Research Lab in London. To my left, again, we have Rhett Russo, who is an architect and educator. He's an associate professor in architecture at NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology, and he's the principal of Specific Objects Incorporated. And also to my left, we have Casey Rehm, Casey Rehm, who many of you know. Casey Rehm is a designer and algorithmic consultant working through his studio Kinch, based in Los Angeles, and he currently teaches here at SCI-Arc. So I'd like to kick this off. I mean, we have a few different forms of media. I think in this panel there are several videos that I'd like to show in a second. But in order to set the stage, I wanted to just give a few definitions. Those of you who know me know that I love words, so I absolutely get really excited when I'm given a title such as this. The idea of the aberration. To aber, to go astray. Aberrance, the action of straying or vagary. Aberrant, straying from the right path, deviating from the normal type. Something to think about here. Aberration, the action of wandering away, deviation from the normal type. In optics, the non-convergence of rays of light to one focus. In astronomy, an apparent displacement of a heavenly body occasioned by the joint effect of the Earth's motion and the non-instantaneous transmission of light, called also an aberration of light. Then we jump to the word weird. Some of you have been talking about this. Weird, in its substantive form, is actually the principal power or agency by which events are predetermined, a supernatural or marvelous occurrence or tale. The adjective, having the power to control the fate or destiny of men, claiming such power, partaking of or suggestive of the supernatural, a mysterious or unearthly character, uncanny, of strange or unusual appearance, odd-looking, out of ordinary course, strange, unusual, hence off or fantastic. And then, you know, the term anomaly, this is a kind of, a lot of A words coming up here, the aberration, the anomaly, came up last night. The term abstraction came up last night. I mean, the anomaly, also an irregularity or a deviation from the common or natural order, whatever the natural order might be. I think that's something I really would like to talk to you all about today. Exceptional conditions or circumstances. And with that, I go to a passage from the writer Jorge Luis Borges, where he is talking about a character, Funes the Memorious is the name of this story. Funes is a character who remembers photographically everything that he encounters, every instant of his life. So he was, not let us forget, almost incapable of ideas of a general Platonic sort. Not only was it difficult for him to comprehend that the generic symbol dog embraces so many unlike individuals of diverse size and form, it bothered him that the dog at 314, seen from the side, should have the same name as the dog at 315, seen from the front. I suspect, however, that he was not very capable of thought. To think is to forget differences, to generalize, to make abstractions. Again, thinking about some of the stuff we discussed this morning and last night, the idea of the abstraction. In the teeming world of fewness, there were only details, almost immediate in their presence. And this passage also from the same text, Locke, in the 17th century, postulated and rejected an impossible language in which each individual thing, each stone, each bird, and each branch would have its own name. Fewness once projected an analogous language, but discarded it because it seemed too general to him, too ambiguous. In fact, Fewness remembered not only every leaf of every tree, of every wood, but also every one of the times he had perceived or imagined it. Towards the east, along a stretch not yet divided into blocks, there were new houses unknown to Fewness. He imagined them to be black, compact, made of homogeneous darkness. In that direction, he would turn his face in order to sleep. So the only way he could find rest from this deluge of constant imagery was to imagine black, homogeneous darkness. So again, I think that when we look at the work of our panelists, and I'll be jumping a little bit between several forms of media here, we will see, I think one of the things we could discuss is what does it mean to stray from that normal course? What is that normal course? And how do we make these distinctions that would allow us to consider this work as proposing an aberrant form? So we'll begin with a segment of a video by Lucy McRae. Is it?
Maybe hit the space button.
When the body is contained within low pressure, the senses are deliberately isolated, shifting the biology of the body. What it's doing is having a cellular effect on the circulation of the body. When a vacuum is applied to the skin, it automatically sends fresh oxygen to the blood cells, draining waste through the lymphatic system. It can affect the appearance and smoothness of skin. It's a sensation that feels as though you're being hugged by a machine. This study is about the implications zero gravity has on the body and how we will need to prepare for the rigours of more permanent weightless living.
And now we will follow with a selection of the work of minimoforms, Theodore Spyropoulos. by name. I'm going to let this, this slideshow will circulate so you can see Ferda Kolatan's work, Rhett Russo's work, some of my work as we begin this conversation. So again, I would just like to open up the discussion to this issue of the aberrant. Do we agree that this is something that each of us is working on? Maybe we start there.
Me? I think, I've been thinking a lot actually about the word estrangement or aberrant. I mean, it seems we all like to use some kind of word that distinguishes what we consider to be the normal path or the right path, as you pointed out in your original definition. And I think in certain ways the interest of anybody who is a designer, a progressive designer, is of course to do something that has a unique quality and authenticity, and therefore, by definition, in my opinion, it has to distinguish itself in some way from what we perceive to be the normative, and hence, therefore, there is a quality of estrangement by definition in the work. I think the difference, maybe what has been happening in the last few years in terms of the discourse, is trying to understand on a different level what methods and techniques of estrangement can be used, how can it be applied, what is actually, I don't like to use the word aberration that much, more like in terms of, again, the estranging, to me, for instance, can happen in the work that you're showing from SU11. It can happen between the observer and the object. It can happen between the exterior of the object and the interior of the object. It can happen in terms of the treatment of facade elements vis-a-vis the geometry of the building. So rather than thinking, for instance, of those relationships in terms of a modernist notion of continuity and relationship, what if we begin to play them off of each other in ways that kind of create a different interstitial condition that we then begin to understand vis-a-vis its opportunities to estrange our idea not only of the object itself, but our relationship to it and the relationship of the object to the world and other objects and so forth. So I'm kind of interested in that when it comes to that notion of, let's say, the weird or the strange. But I do believe the problem when we talk about these terms is that we do establish a belief that we know what the normal is or the right thing from which we then go away. And I think that's pretty arrogant if you really think about it. So I don't think it really holds if you think a little deeper about it. And I don't know where that leaves us, but I do not believe in anything that in any absolute manner does exist on a universal level, which we can call the norm one way or the other, because in my opinion at least, everything is in constant flux. So I think we got to be more, I guess, specific and clear through which techniques we estrange, rather than use that word just in a rather sort of general condition as the other. I don't really think it's about that.
Well, I'm also curious why, the word coming from the 1920s from Victor Shklovsky, why the return of that term? I mean, have we always, in some sense, dealt with estrangement? I mean, why are we currently interested in that issue again? In the 1920s, Shklovsky is writing about that. Clearly, there's an interest in terms of formalist criticism. And why do we return?
Well, I think that for me, there's something going on with all of this work that technology, and maybe even more so, that the sort of conceptions we have of what is technical have completely started to sort of dissolve, not only in terms of the way we exist in the world, but also the tools we have and the way we work. So for me, the return of that term is really interesting in the context of understanding our relationship to technology and how are even our aesthetics changing in the context of technical objects. So for me, I think it's not so much returning to old forms of abstraction, but actually asking new questions about what relationships we find ourselves in relative to other objects. So I also think it's interesting that there's a certain kind of, at least for us, for me, a way of asking ourselves again, is there something important or about essentialism that we're maybe, that is inherent in sort of rethinking the way we examine things? And I think the estrangement question has sort of put a cloud over thinking about essentialism in a way that I find a little bit worrisome, because I think it's very easy to gloss over these things, as Ferda was alluding to, and miss what the kinds of discoveries are in all of this work. So
I also think, to your question, why is this relevant? I mean, it seems there are a couple things that happen in recent history. One, of course, is the sort of advancement of new media, the internet, technology, computation, fabrication, robotics, which really altered, I mean, that's the other subtitle here, right? The weird nature part, which really altered our understanding of categories of, let's say, culture and nature. I think we can all agree that that's not even debatable at this point, and that was a big debate. I remember in the 90s, when we went to school at Columbia, there was still the idea of an actual nature and an actual culture, and the virtual was beginning to blur those lines with data gloves and goggles and all that kind of stuff. And I think we've certainly come to an acceptance that nature is much weirder because it is less categorically identifiable, right? And this basically runs against the tendency of centuries of placing nature as a real outside of our perceptive abilities. And there was always sort of a notion that the real and nature is basically one thing. And I think, throughout the Enlightenment, the focus was to understand nature basically through facts, which were the means of establishing what the real is. And I believe, lately when we look at cultural production, not only in architecture, but if you look into photography, you look into documentary filmmaking, there is an interest in playing with notions of facts and fiction, which seems to be a much larger desire to break down those barriers in order to open up different opportunities. And I think that's certainly one way how I think about design, ask myself what that could mean in architecture.
And Lucy, do you want to touch on that? Because some of these issues related to how you are positioning the body in much of your work, and even using that word, the body, sort of disembodying the body in a sense, talking about preparing oneself for zero gravity.
Yeah, I think in terms of like straying for me is not the point or the purpose or the output, but for me perhaps it's more about the creative process. And in a lot of my work I use my own body to kind of test, so it's coming from very primal, intuitive starting point. So I tend to stray, I tend to be curious in the beginning, and Prepping the Body for Space was a project that started to explore the implications zero gravity will have on the body, and it's now turned into a project which I'm developing with King's College in London about can controlled vacuum pressure to the body, which is essentially synthesizing a hug, trigger the natural release of oxytocin from the brain. So it's sort of strayed really out of my control in a way, but yeah, and I'm also interested in the kind of, if we talk about synthetics and combining like the interaction of the human with the machine, and that becomes interesting with this kind of domination of virtual reality at the moment. How can we make that more physical?
Well, yeah, and it's curious that, I think returning to the issue of representation that's come up on the various tables yesterday and today, that, in every instance, we put something out there as an image or an artifact or an object. The body as your object. I mean, in that scientific research, one could say, okay, the implications of that live somewhere in the world, but the choice of how you produce the space of the cinematic space using your, I assume, your own body, with the pressure being applied to it and actually showing that as a moment unfolding in time, that it seems very important in your work that we also have that image of that there is a certain legibility of what we would consider or agree to be a human body, but then something else is happening where it appears to be something very much in flux or fluid. So there are moments where, again, this issue of abstraction, there are moments where it drifts away from the reference to the body, the way you frame the video, the way you start with very tight shot and then zoom out. And I guess that, I don't know if that's something I'm projecting onto your work or if that's an intention.
No, I kind of taught myself filmmaking after a collaboration that I did called Lucy and Bart, which was very much focused on photography. And I guess I moved into filmmaking because I was interested in more movement, which probably comes from a background of being a ballerina. And so when I'm editing a film, it's very, it's about revealing, it's about a kind of narrative. But I'm also interested in sort of being able to blur the biological edges of the body, or what we perceive is where the body ends and the environment starts. And I did a project in 2011, which was looking at it was a swallowable perfume about a cosmetic pill that you eat, and when you perspire a fragrance. So can we then give new programs or new functions to the body which are kind of happening at the moment, but turning it, kind of completely blowing apart what we know as pharmaceuticals in the luxury industry, and if you make a hybrid between those two. So I guess blurring the edges of the body in a physical or visual way, and also in a biological way, is interesting for me.
And it seems to touch on some of Theo's work with the installation that we saw presented in with both of those projects. Maybe you can elaborate.
I mean, in terms of some of the terms that you're mentioning, like for us personally, we don't really foreground technology. And I think if those terms these days are reappearing and they become operational, then I think the questions about the motivation is really important. So for example, maybe because I'm coming from the UK and have a little bit of Cedric Price influence being in the context of the AA, he always said technology was the answer, but what was the question? So if it brings to bear, I think, new conceptual ways of making things accessible, then I think that is something that I obviously feel quite strongly about. But I think in terms of some of the concepts of nature and weirdness, it's personally in our own work, we don't use these terms, if I'm honest, my confessional here. Because in some ways, I think what we're really interested is in the everyday, and I think it resonates with some of the work that I see here, which is this isn't about constructing a science fiction, it's become fact. And to operate in the world of the everyday, I think, is a really radical project right now. And for me, I'm interested in celebrating diversity, and as long as that becomes something that could be shared and collective, then I think that opens up, I think, a complexity of how we try to communicate actually what it is that we're doing. And I also think a lot of this work, let's say I'll speak about my own work in particular, is in the process of becoming. So we try to prototype ideas and to put it out there in the world to try to enable and make accessible to different audiences and to engage in it instead of trying to project onto it, let's say, a certain kind of assumed interaction or a certain kind of response. We're much more kind of curious about exploring behaviors in a much more conceptual way, if that's through materials or if that's through robotic installations, environments. And so.
Yeah, I'm curious about that use of the word everyday, because I would never have expected you to describe your work as being about the everyday? Because to me, all of these situations seem very unusual. Again, there's a certain aberrant, the idea that we are in a darkened space, as we are here, maybe it is normal.
Sure.
In the morning of the, but that you enter a darkened space, you encounter these objects which begin to move as you approach them. That, to me, that would seem anything but everyday. So maybe you can elaborate on what you mean by the everyday.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, I think, let's say, for example, with that project, it was a project that we were developing for a couple of years, and then we're given the opportunity at the Frac Center. And for them, they were interested in creating an environment to isolate them from other kinds of interactions, let's say, curatorially speaking. But let's say, for example, in that context, it may be a black box, but we didn't actually create any artificial territories so that people could move through them and be much more engaging with these kind of lifelike processes. We had a chance to show it in London. We purposefully took it out of that box and installed it in the center of the Barbican Center and in the common space and the public space to use that as a way, as an experiment to actually see what kind of influences, what kind of interactions could that tease out. So for us, I think we're always trying to respond in some way to a kind of process that's kind of evolving certain ideas. So those contexts are important to us because they take prototypical ideas and they test them in very highly specific and contextual relationships. And that has an influence about how we actually see that work and how it actually engages others.
But again, I think it's interesting the way these things look. Like if we take the image that's on the screen now of Ferda's work, sorry, this is on a timer, so they come and go, ephemeral. But take that image, or the Baltic Bathhouse, another of your projects. The idea that those things sort of slip into, I would say, a kind of unstable territory where, because there is a certain monolithic quality and a containment, they sort of challenge, my normal assumptions of what a building might be, might do, might look like. And I guess in that case, there is the referent of something that is grounded, that has mass. And so there's a difference, I think, in terms of like Theo's work, the fact that your pieces look the way they do, the fact that they are these kind of white plastic or PET or forms. I guess it's a question, again, like we were talking with Lucy, that you recognize the human body, the human figure, and then there's a slipping away from that where the foil or the Melanex starts to almost become like a quicksilver. And so I guess each one, in a sense, is sort of trying to challenge the norm. But in Theo's case, I think that the norm is, I don't know what the norm for that.
I think one interesting element is, if I look through them in response to your question, in Theo's work, to me, the question of the everyday is also a problem, because I don't believe in that really either. I mean, what is the everyday? I wouldn't know outside of right now this is the everyday, and we walk outside and we talk, and it's the everyday. So I'm not quite sure how that would make me think about the project in a different way. Outside maybe of a kind of interactive component, which I think is something that seems to be very clear in Theo's work, but also in terms of the body imprint. I mean, those projects seem to rely much more directly or kind of advance more directly the relationship of the body or the interaction of the human with the object, that kind of thing. And in the three projects you're showing, by the way, these are all done in my office with SC11 with my partner Eric Schoenberger, so I want to just put that out there too, of course, is kind of a distance between the observer or even the user and the object, be it an architectural object or, the first project is more of a sculpture, very distinctly trying to actually not have an interaction or really work more with distance. And again, some of it comes from my interest in photography, where the distance between the object being photographed and how you approach it is being used to estrange certain kinds of qualities. So I think that would be one I mean, clear difference in terms of how you interact with the designs or the projects. I don't know how that relates to the everyday life question, but I think that's definitely something that I just was watching these go through and becomes very obvious.
Well, I think bringing it, over to this corner of the discussion, that in both Casey's work and Rhett's work, one could think about other forms of estrangement that, for Rhett, maybe it's a kind of estrangement of material behaviors, the way that ceramics would normally behave or organize themselves or be organized, the way that in both now I wish we had the image right here. Let's see if I can go.
The stool?
Well, the stool and this piece. Sorry. In this piece, as far as I understood, that this is the deposition of powdered ceramic, like a slip.
Well, what
that
it
then is fired.
It's. I mean, traditionally, the notion of within the field of ceramics is the notion that with clay is that you bring some image and impress it onto the material. And so we wanted to. I mean, with this piece, we had been obviously trying to do that, and very maliciously in a way, force with the stool the material into a set of relations that it normally wouldn't ever in clay really be able to achieve without using some other kind of reinforcement. So there's a limit aspect, or what I would refer to as an obdurate aspect of the material that we want to just run completely off the table. And with the granular project, what we were interested in was the fact that the granular material itself we think of as a kind of natural material, akin to a kind of glacial deposit, but in fact, in this case, it's very engineered. It's a microsphere, so it's like organizing forms out of millions of ball bearings, super small, and letting them self-organize. So we wanted to empty the content out of the object, let the objects themselves produce some new formation, and then begin to cultivate the behavior from there. So I guess on one hand, there's a very forceful approach towards the material, and on another, a very hands-off, empty content approach that we are continually trying to reproject into new situations. So that's where I think the abstraction for us ventures off into a new territory, because it's not about necessarily playing by the rules, but in a sense rewriting the rules and starting with a new set of assumptions and a new vocabulary for architecture.
And literally, to use a Graham Harman word, bending the properties of things. It seems in that chair, when I first saw the image, before I realized it was ceramic, I thought, one could imagine that being made of other materials, which would seem, it would be less astonishing in a sense, and then when one knows that it is ceramic and you imagine firing that and having that the stresses that for anyone who's worked with ceramics, that that is like it's really pushing the material to the limits of its feasible behavior, I think. And you called it an obdurate nature of the material.
Yeah, and I think that's where this sort of detailed fondling that was talked about the other night for us is super important, that it's and that's why I was sort of making mention of the essentialist argument. I think for us, there's something really important about believing the essentialist argument, that there is an essential something, fully knowing full well we can't access it, if only to get to some new set of relationships. And that's where the estrangement within the context of the material and the technology itself becomes, for us, very interesting and opens up a new territory, I think.
And then and the other form of estrangement that I wanted to lay out on the table possibly was the estrangement of computation, or the computational environment that occurs in Casey's work. But I don't know if you would ever call it that or think of it that way, or...
That's loud. I actually kind of, in a lot of the things I'm working on, have a similar view that Theo does, that I'm actually appropriating things that are become fairly commonplace culturally within what I'm doing. So not this thing, but the the kind of the split screen 2 still images of the color is a set of is come out of a series of collaborations I've been doing, and the video at the beginning with the photographer in Japan. And there's a well, this thing and 2 back. I mean, it's like actually a lot of the work is as I'm trying to explore the relationship of the kind of figurative, the narcissistic, the kind of way that the kind of younger generations and let's say larger culture of the millennials, which is that's a very terrible way to start an argument. I mean, there's a dominance of narcissism, of kind of narrated and constructed self-referential imagery. So like these are 2 stills from kind of augmented mirrors, or kind of playing off of kind of web cameras, the kind of constructed narrative of the self-image that people use on social media. These things are kind of hard to represent actually in this way because as static images, I don't think they're particularly interesting. And also like even with the first thing, which is a video, as a video, I don't think it's interesting. What I think is interesting about the kind of the photography destroying machine is that my role in that process is not about producing a kind of final resolved composition, but it's an endlessly running machine that was exhibited over the course of 2 weeks that is more about interaction with that particular photographer. So she could upload continuously over the course of the exhibition new images. She has a fairly consistent style, so it's really easy to get them to work together. But it was about that kind of imagery being continuously molded together and deformed by pretty commonplace like computational methods that are basically ingrained in everything that we work with, whether it's kind of healing imagery for video or compression for uploading stuff to the internet. So there's something about that work that I actually don't think is particularly related to aberration necessarily, at least in the way that I view it. Apparently I didn't know what weird meant before today. The part about kind of having.
I didn't either. I got the OED out this morning.
So now that I know that part of weird is having a power over men, I actually do think that there's an element of that in what I'm trying to do with the mirrors, because I'm trying to begin to introduce the kind of mirror into the kind of augmented image into the architectural space, so that it produces kind of aberrant behavior in the occupant, or it's really more about conditioning the behavior of the people that are experiencing it. And I actually think like Theo's thing does that pretty well. Like if you were to extract the people from the context of your inhuman tentacles and they were standing around going like this, like I think we would probably recognize it as pretty aberrant behavior or kind of weird behavior. Or like when I had one of the top mirror was, we had it up just for fun. I mounted it on the vending machine thing that we built for the VS last semester. People would start to do peculiar positions. It's a little bit, I mean, it's silly. It's like there's an aspect of the funhouse in it. Like if you film people in fun houses without recognizing that they're in fun houses, their behavior certainly would appear aberrant. And so it's much more about the kind of, instead of like taking the figure and making it mutable or kind of erasing its edges, it's more about taking the figurative and putting it into kind of asocial or inhuman behaviors of recognition, more like kind of Hieronymus Bosch versus Francis Bacon. I think that's all I got.
Yeah. I mean, I think just building on what Casey was mentioning and what Ferda was talking about, because I think there are distinctions that make differences. And when I was listening to Ferda explain the role of the observer, I could say that we have a difference, let's say, in our attitude towards that. So let's say in my own interests anyway, I want the observer to be an active participant. I want the participant to become a performer. And when I speak about the everyday, it's more towards this motivation of actually teasing out the curious nature of everyday interactions and making it more disruptive in some terms, or actually just situating things that people think they understand but actually don't have direct access to. So this petting zoo project, I think for us is the last project that we've done, but it's an important one for us because it's also questioning the role of robotics in a different way. So instead of a robotics for production, it's a robotic installation in some sense, but it's more about teasing out emotive and more behavioral kind of relationships that I think are forming and are in the process of engaging the way that we really communicate with each other, and sort of opening that up into a more spatial medium or platform, and in a sense, I think returning it back into architecture when a lot of these experiments that were done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s kind of moved away from architecture because architecture was too much grounded in material practice and it became immaterial and about communication. I think now we've seen that revolution, and I think this is where architecture in some sense, for regardless of how each of us may individually operate, I think has a very strong value that is unstated, and it's in one sense I think important for me to try to make that accessible, because at the end of the day, like how I see my work or how other people see my work is not really that relevant, but being able to sort of build a certain kind of conversational framework and to allow this thing to be instrumentalized, I think is very important to the way that we see some of the things that we're doing.
But again, yeah, I'm curious about the degree of deviation from the norm, in a sense. I mean, the other day in one of the classes here, we were having a discussion about a book that several of you have contributed to, Michael Young's and Young and Ayada, The Estranged Object, which I know that both Rhett and Ferda have also contributed to. We were talking about Jeff Wall and the photograph that Michael is addressing in the book, the cleaning of the Mies van der Rohe Foundation, and the fact that the strangeness of that is it's a very subtle move that occurs over time, duration, encountering that image where at first, you know, we think, okay, we're seeing a scene of some very mundane activity, and then we start to realize the way in which the focal plane is distributed throughout every kind of pixel of the image, that something is not natural, as it were. And I guess, you know, that's where I'm curious, all of the things that we make and all that our choices of what these things look like, and, you know, like Theo, would your work be different if you're saying, okay, the everyday, if the robotic mechanism or the robotic entity would be embedded in something that, you know, would slip into like this water bottle, rather than so that one encounters this and it's slowly moving on the table. Very different, I think, from the objects that you produce, which have their own, they're very highly designed. And I'm curious about that choice. Like, when does it, because we were having this discussion in the studio with Casey as well the other day, that the degree to which things are palpably other, or they slip into a kind of much more subtle guise where it may take centuries to discover that they are in fact different. I don't know, I'm just curious about that. I think with all of our work, that there is this aspect.
I mean, it's probably like a fair assessment to also see the differences between an installation or something that has to deal with a certain immediacy and, let's say, other kinds of ways of constructing, let's say, the uncanny or some of the other sort of terms of reference that you guys have put on the table. But I think at the heart of it, I think it's important that these things in some way have a way to, I keep using the word making accessible, because in some sense I think that's how it kind of upgrades the larger conversation, which takes it beyond academia or forums like this and actually puts it in environments that actually challenges people. Like, I'm very interested in the curiosity that people have when they're enabled to kind of engage things not in a habit way. And I think that that opens up, I think, certain kinds of territories which I think are very much part of our contemporary condition. And we have a certain accessibility to information and to a kind of collective project that I think sort of opens that up even more. And for me, that's a very important thing, and also separates that from conversations of the past. Like, I may use certain terms that resonate with me that have certain affinities to cybernetics and other forms of conversations of the past, but evolving that stuff to today and realizing that we have a very different contemporary condition, I think that opens up interesting creative friction, which I think is important, so that design actually provokes people and basically makes things, I think, much more engaged.
You know, I think what I think is interesting in this conversation with you, and I'm going to get get back to a couple of things you said. One is the question of engaging. Clearly, I think I would also want people to engage with the projects that we design. It's just a matter of what kind of engagement. I think that is what sort of differentiates, let's say, on that level, you know, maybe what you guys do and maybe more what Rhett and I do. I don't know if I can bundle you in, but sure. But what is interesting is your use of the word accessibility, because that seems to be, you know, one of the key words with some of the debates that are going on with speculative realism and so forth, like what is accessibility, and is that something as architects we actually want to allow? We believe that we can actually go there, or do we accept a certain level of inaccessibility? Well, what does that mean? Is that just something to postulate and then move on, or actually try to trigger some kind of you know, recognition on the part of the person using or watching or seeing architecture that there is a quality of withdrawnness, right? And I think I'm personally, lately at least, more interested with that part, that there is a quality that is maybe not accessible or not easily accessible, and that's good, that's fine. And I don't need necessarily to develop, let's say, an architectural ethic of access, because I don't really believe, if I look at the world outside of academia, everywhere, the norm, it doesn't exist there either, right? It's just sort of a veneer, in my opinion. So on that level, I feel actually quite, you know, comfortable to say that we have to start dealing with questions of inaccessibility and withdrawnness, just in the same way that with an older paradigm, we talk much more in terms of accessibility and transparency and those kinds of questions.
Does that translate, like in the image that we're looking at here in the Baltic bathhouse, does that translate into a particular kind of treatment of the mass, where, in a sense, there's a literal kind of degree of inaccessibility where fenestration is not apparent or overt? It may be latent in the kind of striations. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to the degree to which that literally those techniques that we translate as architects into.
I mean, Hernan was saying yesterday during a dinner that, you know, he's all for literacy. And I think to a certain degree, I completely agree with that. I feel much more comfortable if I can be literal about certain ideas. I try to sometimes undermine that, but I think it is important for the way how we work that we have a set of ideas we try to get out there. Always knowing that there hopefully be more to the project anyway, completely, you know, out of our hands. So I don't worry so much about that part. But in this case, one of the issues of, let's say, inaccessibility or withdrawnness, or trying to blur the categorical boundaries of certain fact-based architectural qualities is the relationship between, let's say, the geometry and then the facade treatment. Another is, by the way, these are all railway ties. Basically, yeah, and it's actually, the scale is correct. They're just sort of kind of put on top of each other and layered on top of the original geometry, trying to obscure, you know, the object or the geometry of the object through that layered texture. But it's also, of course, obscuring the idea of windows and light and doors and those kinds of things. Because we don't get enough light in there, we have to have these huge sort of circular openings in order to make the building work from the inside, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I mean, there is certainly a kind of literal approach to what do we show, what do we hide, how do we create a zone, interstitial zone of not really knowing, having to explore and make that part of the engagement of interest in this particular project.
And yeah, there is something where even the subtle pitching of the roof, and where it sort of takes on some conventions or norms. I mean, it's a very flattened, very subtle pitch, but nonetheless, we can see it within a sort of building type that's work is being done on. And I guess that's where I'm curious, the extremes, like with Theo, I would suggest yours are much more, they really push that's why I was saying I wouldn't consider it every day.
Yeah.
I would consider those as very kind of special events or moments where you're engaging with an object that has a very particular formal quality that one doesn't see every day. So to me, there's a real difference in degree there in terms of the subtlety of the operation. And maybe, I don't know, do you want to speak to that, one of you guys? The issue of subtlety, the overtness. I mean, it's because it's something that in the early work of Servo, in my own practice, we did a lot of kind of interaction design projects. And we always became, at a certain moment, kind of frustrated by the fact that as people engaged with the thing, it was almost like once you figure it out, got it, okay, I'm comfortable with it, I can assimilate it into my understanding of reality and move on. It was so I guess that sense of like the delay, that something might withdraw and take much longer to kind of understand, is something I personally am very interested in as well.
No, but I would say that I am as well, but for a different, let's say, with a different attention. So for example, if it is just a reactive piece, then that novelty obviously doesn't sustain itself and people get really bored and move on. But if people are allowed to engage these things and they start to build, move from novelty into different forms of understanding, and then they could instrumentalize that and make it behave, different ideas of control are opened up. And I think the idea of time as being a medium for architects to play with becomes, I think, a really important factor. And I could say in different ways, I mean, some of the arguments that are being discussed in terms of the nature of some of the work, sometimes buildings aren't the answer. And so I think it's important to kind of look at this thing as much more an ecology of, like I would use the word interacting, if you want to call it objects or instances or whatever. But this kind of deeper ecology and synthesis, I think, challenges conventions of nature, which is already a very highly artificial kind of way of relating to the world. And in a way, like, I feel like I do share a lot of some of these terms, but I guess, let's say, with the attention of the project that was selected, its attention is very much about trying to evolve new relationships without prefiguring what that would be. And that's why the installation for us is really like a time-based experiment, and it's important in the methodologies that we use to basically develop our own work.
Maybe I can just continue a little bit about this kind of feedback loop. And recently I've been using the gallery as like a usability test and creating situations where audience members become vulnerable, kind of laying down inside this vacuum, revealing themselves. And I'm interested in how that, I didn't know that I was interested in it, but for an example in this, which I've since then created the Future Day Spa, which I showed at the Recode conference in LA. And one gentleman came and laid down in this vacuum chamber and halfway through said, "Can I expose something about myself?" And I was like, "Sure." And he went on to say that he is one of these humans in the world that chooses not to be touched by other humans, and other humans do not touch him. And it was a really emotional moment, and he said, "This feels like I'm in an embrace." And so I gave him an extra long treatment, and he got out and he hugged me at the end. So it was this really, that completely changed the trajectory of my research. I'm kind of, ditching the original part of it, and now I'm starting to look at kind of, EEG in combination with these artistic provocations. So I think that engagement for me was a really important part of using the audience to tell me where I'm going next. And I'm doing a project with Skylar Tibbetts at Storefront in 2 weeks, and we're very much treating the gallery like a case study and the audience as lab rats to kind of test this jamming technology that we're using. So yeah, I think that's the kind of engagement for me that's interesting right now.
I think like, and I think this was in the case in your work and some of the other things that we've seen today, that they're in relationship to kind of both the abstraction and the withdrawn and the kind of let's say that I think that there are certain projects that we're seeing today which were maybe removing themselves from the problem of abstraction, and not abstract in terms of non-representational, but in terms of reductive processes. And I think that a lot of, so I would say like the things which are kind of open extensive systems, which aren't based on simulation. Like in some of my projects, I'm utilizing simulation quite a bit as a formal generator, and other ones, the formal generator is not a simulation. It exists kind of in real time with the entities. So there's a much more complex interaction, a much more complex product than what you could achieve through the kind of standard discrete kind of process of design. And I think that there's, like linked with that is that the more sophisticated these techniques are becoming, they're also subseding more into the, they're less perceptible or they're more withdrawn. So which also leads to a greater amount of accessibility. Like I think that there's a trajectory within technology right now where the most sophisticated kind of computation or technology is actually aiming at receding or mediating your world in a way that makes it easier for you to engage it without actually having to understand any of those operations that are doing it for you. And so, your project with Embrace is incredibly sophisticated, using biochemistry to trigger kind of affective responses. But when people are in it, do you tell them that they're getting their oxytocin things? Or
no, I've since worked out that that's potentially what this could be doing, but I didn't know before.
Because I think it's more interesting without the people inhabiting the hug to not know that. Like that it's the kind of sophistication of their interface to that the kind of affect is completely hidden. But it's also incredibly kind of sophisticated non-reductive loop for the production of an experience.
So I think you've all kind of presented us with various ways of really understanding this idea of to aber, the aberrant, what might be considered a norm. I think in a way we don't have a consensus, which is great. I hate those kind of conferences where everybody walks away and it's like, okay, we've come to a consensus and now we're going to write our 12 points of aberrant architecture.
I like when it's odd looking. I think we can probably have a consensus on that. All this stuff is odd looking in a good way.
So thank you all. I really appreciate your participation. Also, I'd just like to thank our conference organizers, Hernan Diaz-Alonso, Todd Gannon, Tom Wiscombe, for the Unconference Conference. It's kind of the most fun I've had on a conference session in this setting, despite the fact that the time clock is kind of ticking and making me nervous. But yeah, I really appreciated this opportunity to engage in this kind of conversation with people I respect very much. So, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.